In the last video, we have seen the budget constraint of the consumer. Budget constraint of the consumer represents set of all those bundles that the consumer can purchase with his given income. For the sake of convenience, we took two goods consumed by the consumer, and we assumed that good 1 is any good that the consumer consumes, denoted by x1, and good 2 is set of all those goods that the consumer can buy. So we just assumed that good 2 is nothing but the money with the person or the consumer. Next basic requirement was the price of the goods. Price of goods x1 was denoted by the variable p1, and price of goods x2 was denoted by the variable p2. Now, to know the amount of goods x1 consumed at the given price p1 and amount of goods x2 consumed at the given price p2, we must know the income of the consumer. So, let the income of the consumer be M. M. So this is the given income of the consumer. We can represent the budget line of the consumer with the help of the equation P1 x1 plus P2 x2 is less than or equal to the income of the consumer M. Here P1 x1 represents the money invested on consumption of goods x1, and P2 x2 represents the money invested on consumption of the goods x2, whereas M is the total income of the consumer. A consumer can spend either amount of money equal to his income or less than his income, but he cannot invest more than his income because there is no money with him to invest more than on his income. Now let us see the budget constraint of the consumer with the help of a graph. In this graph, we have been given x and y axis. On the x-axis, we represent goods 1 consumed by the consumer, and on the y-axis, we represent goods 2 consumed by the consumer. Let's say point BL denotes the budget line of the consumer. On B point, we can see the amount of goods x2 consumed by the consumer when he is consuming 0 units of x1, whereas L shows the amount of goods x1 consumed by the consumer when he is taking 0 units of good 2, that is x2. This L point gives the horizontal intercept of the consumer. We know that the income of the consumer is M and the price of good 1 is P1. So the horizontal intercept can be denoted as M by P1. M by P1 is the horizontal intercept of the consumer lying at point L. Point B shows the vertical intercept on y-axis, and this vertical intercept can be calculated with the help of the income and price of good 2 as M by P2. M by P2 shows the vertical intercept on the y-axis. Now on the budget line, as we have seen the equation, the budget line given to us is BL. So on the budget line BL, we have P1 x1 plus P2 x2 is equal to the income of the consumer, because any quantity of combination of goods x1 and x2 on the budget line utilizes the complete income of the consumer. Hence, we can say that P1 x1 plus P2 x2 is equal to the income of the consumer. Now, let's divide all these terms by P2, the price of goods 2. So, we can write P1 x1 by P2 plus P2 x2 by P2 is equal to M by P2. Again, we can write P1 x1 by P2 plus x2 is equal to M by P2. From here, we can calculate the x2 or the quantity of good 2 consumed by the consumer, which is equal to M by P2 minus P1 by P2 times quantity of goods x1. From here, we came to know that the consumer consumes x2 quantity of good 2, which can be calculated with the help of this equation. Similarly, we can calculate x1 of the consumer or the quantity of good 1 that has been consumed by the consumer as M by P1 minus P2 by P1 x2. In this case, we have divided all the terms by P1, and hence this is the quantity of good 1 consumed by the consumer. In this case, M by P2 is the intercept on y-axis and M by P1 is the intercept on x-axis. Let's write here M by P2 is intercept on y-axis and M by P1 is the intercept on x-axis. So I hope the intercept is clear to you. Now let's move on the other factors which affect the movement of budget line. The first and most important factor which affects the budget line of the consumer is the income of the consumer. In case of the income of consumers changes, the budget line will shift parallelly. If there is any change in the income of the consumer, the budget line will shift parallelly. Hence, we can say that income change shifts the budget line of the consumer parallelly. Now, if the income of the consumer increases, the budget line will shift towards right hand side. Shifts towards right. Whereas if the income of the consumer decreases, the budget line of the consumer shifts towards left hand side. Let's see the movement of the budget line with the help of a curve. Let's assume the amount of good 1 consumed by the consumer has been shown on the x-axis, O being the origin of the axis and y denotes the y-axis. Whereas the goods 2 consumed by the consumer has been denoted or shown on the y-axis. Say BL is the original budget line of the consumer. If the income of the consumer increases, the budget line shifts towards the right hand side. Let's denote this budget line by B1 L1. And if the income of the consumer decreases, the budget line will shift toward left hand side. Let's see. Let's denote this budget line by B2 L2. The movement of budget line towards left hand side or downward shows that the income of the consumer has decreased. Understanding this shift in budget line. If there is an increase in the budget of the consumer or the income of the consumer which causes the budget line to shift toward right hand side, we can see that the consumer can afford more units of goods X1 as well as goods X2. Whereas if the income of the consumer decreases, we can say that the consumption of the consumer of both the goods X1 and X2 has decreased relatively. Higher income creates more choices for the consumer, whereas a lower income takes the income from the consumer and hence he can purchase less amount of both the goods X1 and X2. Now we can also see that BL is parallel to B2L2 and BL is also parallel to B1L1. Since all these three lines are parallel, we can say that the slope of budget line does not change. So if the income of consumer changes, the slope of the budget line remains same. This is because the price of the consumption of both the goods is not affected due to the change in income of the consumer. Hence we can say that the intercept at B was M by P2 and on the point L was M by P1. Whereas when the income of the consumer increased, say to M1, the intercept changed to M1 by P2 on the y-axis and M1 by P1 on the x-axis. Similarly, when the income of the consumer decreased to M2, the intercept on the y-axis was M2 by P2 and on the x-axis M1 by P1. Now finding the slope of these three lines, we have slope of budget line BL is equal to tan theta which is equal to intercept on the y-axis, that is m by p2, divided by intercept on the x-axis, which is m by p1. We have m by p2 divided by m by p1. This gives us the slope as p1 by p2. Now let's find the slope when the income of the consumer increased and the budget line became B1 L1. Again, the budget line will be given by tan theta, and in this case the intercept on y-axis is m1 by p1 and intercept on the x-axis is m1 by p1. So let's write here the intercept on the y-axis divided by the intercept on the x-axis, and this again gives us p1 by p2 as the slope. Now finding the slope of the line B2 L2 when the income of the consumer decreased. This would to be denoted by tan theta, and we have the intercepts on y-axis and x-axis as, on the y-axis we have m2 by p2 and on the x-axis we have m2 by p1. Here we had m1 by p1 and m1 by p2. So m2 by p2 divided by m1 2 by p1. So again we have the slope as p1 by p2. Now we can see that slope of BL is p1 by p2, b1 L1 is also p1 by p2, and b2 L2 is also p1 by p2. Hence we can say that slope of BL equals the slope of b1 L1, which in turn is equal to slope of b2 L2. So the change in income of the consumer does not changes the slope of the budget line, but an increase in income of the consumer makes him afford more and more goods, and a decrease in income of the consumer takes some goods from him. He cannot purchase that amount of goods which he could purchase when his income was BL. Now let us see what will be the effect of change in price of either goods on the budget line of the consumer. We have already assumed that the consumer consumes two goods X1 and X2. So let's take the consumption bundle as X1, X2. Set of two different goods consumed by the consumer. Now let us assume that price of goods X1 is equal to P1 and price of goods X2 is equal to P2. We have also assumed that the income of the consumer is equal to M. In this case, the income will not change, and we will see what will be the result if there is a change in price of goods X1 or there is a change in price of goods X2. Let's see. with the help of a graph. Let's say we have goods 1 on the x-axis, which is good x1, and good 2 on the y-axis, which is good x2. O is the origin. Suppose the price of goods x1 has increased to x1 bar. In this case, the budget line of the consumer will be fixed on the y-axis but will shift towards left on the x-axis. So let's see how the budget line of the consumer looks to be. Here, the budget line has shifted on the x-axis from the point of x1 to x1 bar. At this point, where on the y-axis the consumer is consuming x2 quantity of goods remains same. In this case, the slope of the budget line has changed, and this is because the price of the consumer consuming goods x1 has increased to x1 bar. Since the price has increased, the consumer can purchase less amount of goods x1, and there is a leftward movement in the quantity of consumption of goods x1 by the consumer. In this case, what we can see is the slope of x2 x1 is less than slope of x2 x1 bar. We can see that x2 x1 is flatter than x2 x1 bar, and hence the slope of x2 x1 bar is more than the slope of x2 x1. This is all because the price of goods 1 has increased. Therefore, the elasticity is less than 1 and budget line becomes steeper. So this is in the case of increase in price of goods x1. Let's see what happens if there is a decrease in price of x1. So let's suppose the price of good 1 decreases or falls. So we have y-axis, x-axis, origin. On the y we have goods 2, which is x2, and on the x-axis we have goods 1, which is x1. To see the effect when the price of goods x1 decreases. If the price of goods x1 decreases, which was originally P1, the consumer was consuming x1 quantity of good 1 and x2 quantity of good 2. If there is a change in the price of good 1 and which is a decrease in the price, the budget line will be pivoted at point x2 but will shift rightward in case of x1 because consumer can purchase more amount of x1 with his same given income level. So let's see how it happens. Here we can see that the amount of goods x1 now purchased by the consumer is x1 prime. and this is towards the right hand side of goods X1, which was earlier being consumed by the consumer. Now this budget line of the consumer has shifted from X2 X1 to X2 X1 prime. Now we can also see that the slope of the budget line X2 X1 is steeper than the slope of the budget line X2 X1 prime. This means the budget line has become flatter. This is because the price of the good 1, which is P1, has decreased from its earlier level, and this has caused the elasticity to increase. So elasticity of second line is more than the elasticity of first line. Hence we can say that the curve becomes flatter. So if the budget line changes due to increase in price of commodity X1, which has been consumed by the consumer, we can say that now the consumer can purchase more amount of goods X1. There is an increase in the real income of the consumer because he can purchase more amount of goods X1. So this is the effect of change in price on the budget line of the consumer.